한미 양국을 대표하는 북한인권 전담대사들이 하와이에서 한자리에 모였습니다. 이신화 외교부 북한인권대사와 미 국무부의 줄리 터너 북한인권특사는 어제 컨벤션 센터에서 개최된 2023 북한인권 하와이 컨퍼런스에 참석해 북한 인권 문제에 대한 국제사회의 대응을 촉구했습니다. 어제 컨퍼런스는 민주평화통일자문회 글로벌전략위원회와 UH 동서문화센터, 주호놀루 총영사관, 민주평통 하와이협의회가 공동으로 주최하고 태평양 포럼, 아시아 다이얼로그, 한미동맹재단 USA, 원코리아 네트워크가 공동 주관으로 열렸습니다. 김명혜 민주평통 글로벌전략특별위원장은 인사말을 통해 오늘 컨퍼런스를 통해 북한의 잔혹한 인권 상황을 알리고 북한 주민들과 탈북민들의 목소리를 대변해야 한다고 말했습니다.
We gather here today to listen to our distinguished speakers and panelists, and through their remarks and in-depth panel discussions, we aim to highlight the still appalling conditions in North Korea and call upon the international community, including the United Nations, to take action. Furthermore, in order to improve the human rights situation in North Korea, we must start and take action in Hawaii, which plays a crucial role in the overall Indo-Pacific security. We must also continue to voice our criticism against the Chinese government's brutal policy of forcibly repatriating North Korean refugees. Finally, we must unite and collectively speak out and be a voice for the voiceless in North Korea and North Korean defector community.
첫 번째 기조연설에는 이신화 대한민국 외교부 북한인권 국제협력대사와 미 국무부 줄리 터너 북한인권특사, 모리스 단 리버티 대학교 법대 학장이 함께했으며 이신화 외교부 북한인권대사는 북한 인권과 핵 문제를 분리해서 다루는 것은 효과적이지 않다며 두 문제를 평화에 대한 위협과 반인도적 범죄로 간주해 포괄적으로 접근해야 한다고 밝혔습니다. 줄리 터너 미 국무부 북한인권특사도 기조연설을 통해 미국은 동맹국, 특히 대한민국과 긴밀히 협력해 북한의 심각한 인권 침해와 학대를 지속적으로 조명하겠다며 탈북자들의 목소리를 높이고 북한 안팎으로 자유로운 정보 흐름을 촉진하기 위한 노력을 지원할 예정이라고 밝혔습니다. 이어 진행된 패널 토론에서는 줄리 터너 특사 및 이신화 대사 외에도 수잔 바레스럼 동서문화센터 소장, 랄프 코사 태평양 포럼 평화연구소 석좌, 스티븐 노퍼 아시아 다이얼로그 회장, 모리스 단 리버티 대학교 법대 학장, 그레그 스칼라튜 북한인권위원회 사무총장이 참여해 하와이에서 처음으로 열린 북한 인권 주제 컨퍼런스에 이의를 더했습니다. 이번 북한인권 컨퍼런스는 UN 북한인권조사위원회 발족 10주년 및 내년 10주년이 되는 UN 북한인권 최종보고서 발간을 맞아 다시 한번 북한 인권 실태, 김정은 정권의 계속되는 도발, 그리고 중국의 탈북민 북송에 관한 인식을 높이기 위해서 마련됐습니다.
It's wonderful here today to really have the experts that you've heard already by way of the keynote address, and we'll press ahead with some of the issues and some echoes of what you've just heard on the panel led by Greg Scarlett. And so we'll begin with a question in the context of the relationship between Korea and the United States. We'll ask Ambassador Lee to situate human rights for us in terms of how Korea approaches the United States and what you see in terms of the benefit for our relationship together.
Well, as I said in my keynote speech, there has a COI report in 2014. Although that was initiated by the international NGO, supported by the United Nations, I think still United States and South Korea and like-minded countries was serving as a stepping stone to pushing through the COI report in 2014. But as I mentioned, unfortunately, with the previous South Korean government and the Trump administration appears to, but they didn't cooperate, outspokenly, but I would say they cooperated to silence the problem of North Korean human rights in hopes of reconciling with North Korea in a way to deal with the denuclearizations. So at that time, unfortunately, kind of a cooperation or consensus between South Korea and United States aggravate the situation of North Korea and lost the momentum that was made by COI report in 2014. Now, 2023, well, Biden administration came in 2021 and highlighting importance of democracy and human rights. And in 2022, the Yoon government came into the power and then emphasizing value-based diplomacy and by highlighting the closer relationship between Korea and US. So those two countries' alliance becoming very stronger, but not necessarily only focusing on military alliance, but that goes beyond what they call comprehensive strategic alliance, where human rights issue is one of the important agenda. However, as you see in the historic Camp David summit last August, although they touch upon the importance of the human rights, probably because I'm an ambassador on the human rights issues, probably I want to highlight, or probably it's not sufficient enough to touch upon the issue of the human rights issues in Camp David statement. So hopefully from this point on, hope the US and South Korean government can, based on those Camp David summit statement, hopefully we can mainstreaming the human rights issues when we are dealing with our future cooperation. Particularly, we both are very much interested in the rule-based international order, where human rights and freedom and human dignities are very important. So hopefully Julie Turner and myself can be a stepping stones to push forward our mutual government to mainstreaming the human rights issues in the foreign policy agenda, particularly North Korean human rights issues.
Thank you, Ambassador Lee. And that look you gave her means a lot, because Ambassador Turner, you are the personification of U.S. commitment on this, and it took a while to put an ambassador for human rights into place, but you were confirmed and now are serving in this capacity. How do you see it in terms of a definition of the alliance in broadening security to really include human security and the issue of human rights as a U.S. priority in the alliance?
Thanks, Dr. Norper, for that great question. While security has been the foundation of the US-ROK alliance, there are many other things that factor into that alliance, and that includes the people-to-people ties, which we see through the Korean-American representation here in the room today, as well as other linkages between our two countries. But one of the other underpinning concepts in that ironclad alliance is the shared values between our two countries, free and open democratic societies. I think the Summit for Democracy, as the ROK government takes on the leadership of the Summit for Democracy in the coming year, symbolize that joint effort to promote these values, and human rights being one of them. In the last month, we've restarted the US-ROK bilateral consultations on North Korean human rights. Human rights was referenced in the Camp David summit, particularly as it relates to POW, abductee, and detainee families. As well as in the state visit earlier this year in April, the joint statement put out by our two leaders emphasizes our shared commitment to free and open societies It emphasizes our concern, our condemnation of the human rights violations in North Korea, and what will hopefully be continued close cooperation going into the future to bring about concrete change for the North Korean people. And I very much do appreciate the close contact and collaboration that I've had with Ambassador Lee. We have been doing many speaking engagements together. We are constantly in communication about how we can carry forward both the values that are underpinned in the alliance and under the Universal Declaration for Human Rights.
Thank you, Ambassador Turner. Ambassador Tan, you have, as you mentioned in your talk, just come from Seoul and have served, both as an ambassador on issues that concern this in the prior administration, and now you represent a voice on the SAGES group, the elders who are advancing this along with the Commission of Inquiry investigators who were welcomed by President Yoon Suk-yeol during the course of your meetings there in Seoul last week. How do you balance issues of security and human rights? And what do you think on this, the 10th anniversary of the Commission of Inquiry report, about what we can do forward to grow awareness or to invigorate the results of the Commission of Inquiry, the most comprehensive report on North Korean human rights atrocities?
Yes, the Commission of Inquiry report helped to bring to the forefront of people's minds the gross human rights violations going on in North Korea, I would say more than any other single document. So it's played a major role in that regard. I don't believe that human rights issues should be sidelined in favor of security issues. I think actually addressing them both together increases the chances of solving either crisis or both together. And so there has been a history of sidelining human rights in favor of security, and that does not help because the Kim Jong-un regime fears prosecution. They fear prosecution. And so one of the things I said in Korea is that Korea, based on their constitution, everybody on the peninsula is a Korean citizen, including everyone in North Korea. And they can engage in an in absentia indictment, which means an indictment can happen without any of the North Korean defendants being present in South Korea. If that indictment happens, then there could be a warrant for the arrest of, say, Kim Jong-un. And that would cramp his ability to travel, his ability to go to other countries. It would increase the fear that he and others have. And it's never been tried. It's never been done in South Korea. I've heard different excuses used, like, well, we don't want to out the North Korean refugees. Well, there are ways to protect them by blacking out their names, right? Or calling them Refugee 1, Refugee 2, Refugee 3. There are ways to do that, so that to me is an excuse. There's also the excuse we don't have enough evidence. I think that's nonsense. We have more than enough evidence to move forward beyond a reasonable doubt in regards to the crimes that North Korea is committing against its own people. Further, it's been good to see that the South Korean government is seeking to implement their own North Korean Human Rights Act. And the appointment of Ambassador Lee is one of the ways that has happened. And then the release of the Human Rights Report for North Korea is another way that has happened, and that was the first time that has happened. Furthermore, there could be other mechanisms for prosecution and accountability. There can be a hybrid tribunal that is part international and part domestic, set up to try to prosecute those most responsible for the worst atrocities. Concurrently, there could also be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission set up for those who are least culpable for these mass atrocity crimes. And then domestic prosecution potentially could take the middle area, or it could take part of the top as well. And so this multi-layered approach can help to bring about accountability and justice for the people of North Korea. In the US, Representative Young Kim has been putting forward the reauthorization of the North Korean Human Rights Act this year, but curiously, it has not been reauthorized yet. And also, there has been limited implementation of what is in it, and so a full implementation of a renewed and reauthorized North Korea Human Rights Act in the United States. And by the way, this is very much of a bipartisan issue. Generally, these sorts of votes have little to no opposition from either party. And so, unlike in Korea, there is a lot of unity in America politically around these issues. And so I do want to point that out on the positive side. There are several times that North Korean human rights issues have been raised with the UN Security Council. I believe that should continue. It's been raised in the UN General Assembly. I believe that should continue. It's been talked about in the Human Rights Council. I think every avenue to get the word out, to let people know, the better, as far as I'm concerned. And so these are some of the steps that can be taken to address North Korean human rights issues.
Thank you, Ambassador Tong. And let's move from that very comprehensive legal perspective and the insights of an accomplished jurist to really your boots on the ground as a U.S. Marine and now as an analyst par excellence. How do you situate it relative to your definition of security? You've seen that hard security reality, but how do we pull human rights into your definition? And how do we do that in the context of the neighbors? You've spent a lot of time on Japan, on China. How do we place this as a regional issue as well as an issue for the United States and Korea?
Okay, well, thanks very much. The way that I would look at it is that warfare, security, defense, it is at least half psychological. It's at least half political. It's not just a question of hardware and numbers of troops and aircraft. You have got to consider the other parts of this. And that's where human rights fits in. And I would say that human rights should be an issue of equal importance as nuclear weapons, as missiles, particularly when it comes to the North Korea issue. Now, how so, when looking at it from, say, a military perspective? Well, the first thing is you have got to have people people understand why you're fighting or why you might have to fight. And that includes both your own military, but also your public. You want them to understand exactly why you need to do this. And it's not just because we feel like it, but rather when you can articulate the nastiness of a regime, the human rights atrocities, as part of the reason why we are fighting. And the Americans did something like this in World War II, the Why You Fight series of movies. But you have to articulate that so the public will support what you do, and human rights is one very important aspect of that. Also, you want other countries and other publics, other peoples to support what you're doing. And once again, if you say, well, we want to do it because they're bad, well, that isn't quite enough. And you have to be able to clearly lay out exactly what the human rights issue is here. And this is something that is important to a certain type of nation, which is our kind of nation, the free nations. Other nations don't. It's not as big an issue. But to us, it's absolutely important. And if you make that case that this is about human rights, in part, that you can bring other countries, other public populations onto your side. And you can bring across the people who would otherwise aid and abet, say, North Korea in this case. And that would be, I could name those countries, but they know very well who they are. They are considered decent, good countries, but they seem pretty happy to do business with North Korea to keep that regime afloat. But by publicizing this, and you constantly make the case through different channels, you keep that human rights front and center. And you don't do like unfortunately some administrations have done, said, well, this is just a question of nuclear weapons. We'll take care of human rights later. you never take care of human rights in that case. The other side sees, well, what, it doesn't matter. And so that's one thing to always keep in mind, is that the human rights, the moral aspect of why you are taking your position militarily, why you might have to fight, is essential if you want to be able to do it. It's not just two boxers squaring off. But even in that case, there's a psychological aspect to warfare. But looking at this beyond just the question of North Korea, because it is often looked at, it used to be at least, looked at in kind of a vacuum, in isolation. Well, it's this nutty North Korea, and South Korea might have to fight them, etc. But it really is, there's a regional aspect to this, because what happens on the peninsula very much affects what happens in the rest of Asia, if not the rest of the world. And by the same token, what happens in the region affects what is going to happen on the Korean peninsula. But looking at the question of how you deal, what do you do about it? That ultimately, that you have got to take on the PRC. And their essential, sort of existential support for the North Korean regime, and the acceptance of North Korea's human rights atrocities. You've got to go after China. If you just make it a question of shaming the North Koreans and putting pressure on the North Koreans, while the people who provide the oil, the electricity, the food that keeps it afloat, operate unscathed, well, you're probably not going to have much success. But you do have to say, look beyond just the question of North Korea and look at it from a regional perspective. And I'd say the last thing I would note is that you do have in very recent times, you have the South Koreans and the Americans. Well, we've always gotten along pretty well with this, particularly recently. But this move towards improved relations between South Korea and Japan, and something of I wouldn't call it an alliance, but certainly some pretty good cooperation. This is very important. And it really is something to be applauded and credit where it's due in all quarters. And the last thing I would note is that one often, particularly on you'll often hear that, the North Koreans and the Chinese, they don't care. Yeah, you can criticize them, but they don't care. But actually, in actual fact, whenever we have made human rights a key issue and have really pushed it, they don't like it. And which tells you that you're doing something right. So those are just a few ideas, and it's not just a question of hardware, but it's very much a psychological, political aspect to all of this, and human rights needs to be, as I say, front and center, even when the military is thinking about it. So.
Ambassador Lee, these issues are complex. You've outlined a number in your address today. We've heard some of that complexity in the testimonial a moment ago. And Grant has just mentioned nuclear. You said something in your address that may have caught some ears here about looking at the nuclear issue from a human rights bent, that there is a vulnerability associated with human security. And so I'm wondering, as you prioritize the plethora of issues, the endangerment to women, the threat now posed by nuclear, others, how do you see, for example, that one on nuclear as an issue? It's one we've heard less about. But you're really providing a much broader expanse to how we define these human rights concerns.
I think we have to, in the first place, think about what is the intention of North Korean regime to develop the nuclear weapons. I think it is obvious. They want to maintain their dynastic regime. It's already third generation dynasty there, and appears to they prepare for the fourth one, unfortunately, right, as they highlight their daughter. So what I'm saying is, I think they try to do, or at cost, to maintain this Kim regime. For that, for the external strategy is try to build up their military muscle. And basically, they need some help from China, and to some extent Russia for now. I do believe their end state is they want to make a normalization process with United States. At the same time, they want to keep their nuclear status. I think that is the last thing we South Korea wants to see. Therefore, I think denuclearization might be hard as long as the Kim Jong-un maintain his regime, or any Kim family continue to the regime continuities. Therefore, I think it is very important for us, South Korea should cooperate with the United States very closely to get some red line. That red line have to be like this. Probably we need to think about different way of discussing or negotiating about denuclearization, because for now we've been working very hard for about 2 to 3 decades to denuclearize North Korea, but it didn't work. So that we might need some kind of negotiable process we are required. However, I think end state is no arm reduction talks with North Korea and US without any consultation with South Korea. I think that should be our red line. So I hope the US is the longest and most successful alliance in history of us, right? So that I think US should keep on mind for that one. And on the other hand, internal strategy of North Korea to maintain their regime is very tight control over their populace, because they cannot allow any single oppositions from within, because they know their regime is pretty strong, because it's only maintained by very tight control and the politics of fear. So if they give a little bit of room for people to think about the possibility to change what they are, they know that might collapse overnight. So I think that is the last thing the Kim regime and the small number of the elite group that try to avoid. Therefore, I said on one hand, the nuclear and missile threat, and on the other hand is the human rights violation, is very much linked together. And particularly, I'm not going to repeat again since I already talked, particularly in terms of financing and labor. So I think we have to cut off that linkage. For that, probably number one, those sanctions has to be very targeted, lessons from Magnitsky's law, so that hopefully we, South Korea, can develop some Korea version of Magnitsky's, so that we can identify some detailed list of those individuals who commit some kind of a crime against humanity and etc. On the other hand, I think number two, US can do something. That means assuming North Korea's final goal is negotiating and normalizing their relation with the United States, I think they have to be more eager to give North Korea for what they could do and what they couldn't do. That means they already developed the nuclear weapons, but still, if the United States only highlighting for non-proliferation effort, I think that doesn't go anywhere. So I think the US government should be very clear about denuclearization is our final goal. In that sense, I'm pretty concerned about the next US president election outcome, because it might just withdraw us back to what happened in 2018. So this is very complex manners, but still to understand what happened, why they try to build up the nuclear weapons, has to be understood in terms of both human security perspectives or the broader comprehensive security perspectives.
Thank you, and I know you've also raised this issue that's so striking. A Chernobyl-style situation on the Korean Peninsula would be a gross human rights abuse. Given what you've just said, complexity, Ambassador Turner, we have an incredibly complex global reality right now. It's been mentioned earlier in this session. Just today in the Financial Times, there was a question asked in a major op-ed that said, how can a superpower manage all of these issues, right? We've Ukraine, we've Gaza, a plethora of issues, concerns about Taiwan, and of course, North Korea. How do we keep North Korean human rights up on the agenda? We heard in our last session here that of a person working in the field. How do you, as a policy leader, as a thought leader, look at this in terms of how we can elevate it?
I think we have to frame this within the context of the broader competition, not just the PRC, which is, of course, the pacing challenge for the US government right now, but authoritarians and democracies, and to take North Korea and to internationalize it in the human rights conversation. Oftentimes we talk about North Korean human rights as an oddity, but integrating it into global conversations about human rights will help elevate and draw more governments into a conversation that has largely been led by the ROK, by the United States over the last 2 decades. In particular, thinking about the linkages in how authoritarians work with each other, thinking about how human rights abuses happening in Xinjiang and forced labor of Uyghurs ties into the forced labor of North Korean workers. Is Xinjiang cotton being transferred to factories where North Korean workers are weaving it into textiles? Arms sales from North Korea to the Burmese military, and whether or not those weapons are then being used to commit human rights abuses against the Burmese people. All of these things are interconnected, and talking about that connection between international peace and security and human rights will help mobilize more and more governments to take action. I keep thinking about the common thread that we're hearing here, and that is like, now is the time for action, and I hope that we all walk away from this conference with that thought. But I really encourage people to think about the conversation that Morris brought up regarding accountability and the types of tools that we are using to document abuses, to take action against other authoritarians. Right now, we haven't been using them in the North Korea context in the same way. And thinking about how the US government is able to have a conversation about human rights and security issues with the PRC. We do it with the government of Vietnam as well. We have a human rights dialogue. We also have a security dialogue. But thinking about how we can talk about North Korean human rights as well as the North Korean security situation, security on the peninsula as a part of a holistic policy is really important.